Today I want to go over how to feed your sourdough starter, how to know when it's ready and active, and also when you should feed your sourdough starter, how to maintain it, whether you're baking with it or not. So let's go over how to feed your starter. So let's first see what sourdough starter actually looks like. This starter is not active, it needs to be fed. It also can be called discard. Use a rubber band as a guide to note where your sourdough starter is currently at when you are getting ready to feed it. I have roughly 2 to 3 tablespoons maybe currently. Now I'm just going to scrape everything down to the bottom so you could see exactly how much I have. When you feed it, you want to at least double the amount of flour that you have of starter. And I like to do at least 1.5 times or even 2 times the amount of flour as I have to starter. The top rubber band is my guide to how much flour I'm going to add. Now this is totally optional, but I do add a few scoops of rye flour just to help boost things a bit. You can add some wheat flour or you can even use bread flour to feed the starter. Now I'm just going to use all-purpose flour to feed my starter, and if that's all you have, that is completely enough. Now this would be considered a stiff starter. So the benefit of having a stiff starter, a thicker starter, is that you won't have to feed it as often. Now it's ready for water, and we're not going to add that much water. This is how we get a stiff starter, and that's simply because the starter is not consuming the flour as quickly as if there was more water in it. So I just fed it more flour than there is of starter. So if you have, say, 3 tablespoons of starter in there, then you want to give it at least 3 tablespoons, but ideally like 4 to 6 tablespoons of flour. So 1.5 times to double the amount is good. And I'm just talking about eyeballing it by volume. Now add the water, but I suggest just adding it slowly and mixing it in as you go. So you don't add too much water where it's too thin. You want it to be like a thick paste, like a thick pancake batter consistency. And you just want to mix it up really good. And as you're mixing, you'd want to get some air into it. That's good for the sourdough. And you're just trying to make sure that you don't have any dry bits in it. If you end up with a little dry bits, it's not the end of the world. It's not going to kill anything. But ideally, have all of the flour incorporated into the mixture so it's all mixed well together. And to mix it, you can use a spoon, a spatula, a chopstick, or a butter knife. My go-to is typically a butter knife, but I've used all of the above. Now, this is what your fed starter will look like. It's nice and thick, but it's all well incorporated. It's not runny. A stiffer starter will have more yeast activity, so the bacteria in the starter won't break down the gluten network as quickly compared to if you had a higher hydration starter. Now you just want to lightly cover it and leave it on your counter. I'm leaving the top rubber band on so I know how much starter I currently have. That way I can tell once it's doubled in size. Just using a napkin to cover it, you can use a coffee filter or a piece of cloth. You just want something breathable. Now just let it sit on your counter for 4 to 15 hours approximately. This is all going to depend on how warm or cold your home is. If your house is warm, it's going to rise much quicker. If it's cold, it's going to take a lot longer. If your house is cold, there are ways to speed up the process. What I usually like to do is preheat the oven, turn it off, make sure it's not too hot where I'm going to be cooking the starter, but it's nice and toasty warm. Then I will place my starter in the oven when the oven's turned off, and I'll just let it sit in the oven for a few hours until it starts to rise. If the oven's too warm, I'll just crack open the door. If it's too cold, then I'll preheat it again. Just be sure to take the sourdough starter out so you don't cook it on accident. You can also place it near the stove or oven when you're cooking or baking, or near a fireplace, of course, one that's lit.
Go.
You can wrap it in a heating mat. Just be sure to wrap a towel around it first so you don't cook it. You could also place it near a heater. Just look for someplace warm. Or you can just let it slowly rise. If it's really cold, you could just leave it out on your counter overnight, or even overnight and throughout the day, depending on how cold it is. So for reference, it's about 9 o'clock at night and it's about low 60 degrees Fahrenheit in my house, and I left it on the counter overnight. Okay, it's the next morning at 9 a.m. So it's been 12 hours and we can see it has definitely doubled, pretty much tripled in size. So let's check it out. This is ready. See all the bubbles? That's definitely ready. So you're just looking for it to double in size. Mine deflated a little bit. It was a little higher just because I was poking at it and popping the bubbles for you to see. So at this point, this starter is ready to be used for any recipe, or you can simply close the lid and place it in the fridge and use it for recipes in the next few days that require active starter. So here is another active starter. I started off at the bottom rubber band. That was the amount of starter I had. Then I fed it up to the second rubber band at the top, and then I let it rise, and it took about 8 or so hours, and it's almost doubled in size. How long is active starter good for? At this point, I could either let it sit on the counter for a bit longer or just stick it in the fridge for now. If I was going to be baking something in the next hour or so, I'd just let it sit on the counter. If I wasn't, then I'd stick it in the fridge and maybe bake something with it the next day. It should remain active for a few days in the fridge. You want to plan to feed your starter about once a week. Now, this starter is basically doubled, but if your starter has tripled, that is not a bad thing, but what goes up must come down. So you want to catch it before it starts going back down and stick it in the fridge. Now, when you go to use the sourdough starter for a recipe, you don't have to bring it to room temperature to use it. Just use it straight out of the fridge. And when it's in the fridge, it's still slowly fermenting. It's just on a very, very slow pace. Although maybe not the first hour or so that it's in the fridge because it's still lowering to that fridge temp. Okay, so here's my starter. You can see that it doubled in size in the fridge. So it was almost doubled when I stuck it in the fridge. And I put it in the fridge last night, and it's the following night later, and it doubled. And look at all those bubbles. You want to see those nice big bubbles. See these bubbles? Let's watch it move. But see these big old bubbles, how they're popping in there? That's what you're looking for. That is when you got some good starter and it's active. That's what you want. How do you tell if your starter is no longer active? Let's say I fed the starter and I did nothing with it. What would it do? It would fall back down to the line when it was no longer active. So it would be the same size as when I first fed it. It will also have no bubbles. At that point, you can only use it for sourdough discard recipes, or you feed it again. Now, what do you do if you have too much starter and it's not active? You can pick a discard recipe to make, like crackers or pancakes, or you only feed a portion of your sourdough starter and leave the rest in the fridge as a backup. And you don't need a ton of starter to get things going. I'm just using the scrapings of this starter. And remember, however much starter you have, once you feed it, it's going to be double the amount. Then once you let it rise, it's going to double again. So you're going to be left with 4 times the amount of active starter that you started off with. So don't worry about using all your starter up in discard recipes, especially if you're not planning on baking that many recipes that often. And if you added too much water, don't worry, you can just add a little more flour. If you are planning on baking decently often, then I would aim to have a decent amount of starter, because it's kind of a bummer if you go to make a recipe and then it calls for a cup of starter and you only have half a cup. I usually keep about 1.5 to 2 cups of starter on hand. And I highly recommend having a backup. Don't be afraid to just leave some starter in the back of your fridge, even if you don't feed it that often. Just keep it on hand in case something goes wrong, in case you accidentally contaminated your starter and it developed mold. Or on a whim, you feel like making 4 recipes on your day off, and you want to make sure that you have enough starter in order to feed it, so enough rises to make all those recipes. So to recap, don't feel like you have to feed all of the starter that you have on hand all the time. Just take some out of your starter, start a new jar, and feed that if you're planning on just making one particular recipe, and keep a backup in the fridge. And if you need to consolidate them, you can mix them together as well. Let's say you're going out of town for a few months. What do? Do you have to bring your starter with you to keep it alive? All you need to do is just feed it and place it directly in the fridge. Don't even let it rise on the counter. It will slowly eat up that flour and take its dear sweet time. So it'll have enough to eat while you're gone. I hope you found this video helpful. Please like and subscribe. And let me know in the comments if there's any questions that you have.